Hello everyone. Today I will be featuring a bit of a different vid because one of the most recurring questions I get asked both on YouTube and on stream is people asking me what is the best tier 10 something. In this case, what is the best tier 10 destroyer has been the most asked question as of late. And that's a very hard question to answer because there's really no such thing as a best DD in every situation. They all have situations where they excel, but they also all have situations where they are not particularly good. Some are more versatile than others, but the versatile ones don't necessarily have the strengths of the more specific type of destroyers. So instead of trying to answer the question, which one is the best, I'll instead go over all the tier 10 destroyers and tell them what they are the best at and what they are the worst at. And honestly, I'll leave it up to you to decide which one you think is the best based on, well, either what I said or what your own opinions are. Now, the first in the line is, of course, the Shimakaze. This is probably the most popular destroyer in the entire game, mostly because, well, it used to be a lot stronger and a lot easier to play, and the Shimakaze has long been extremely popular. It's also one of the first, this and the Gearing were the first two destroyers in the game, so a lot of people have it simply because there weren't many options back then. Concealment wise, it sits at a pretty damn good 5.9, which is highly competitive. It gets outspotted by some slightly lower tier, like tier 8 and 9 IGN DDs, but other than that, it has excellent detectability, which means, of course, you are able to contest caps, you're able to scout, but what this ship lacks is artillery power, aka gun power. It simply doesn't have enough gun power to be able to straight up fight any other destroyer. Even lower tier gunboats can easily win a fight against the ship. So it's a purely focused torpedo boat. And of course, torpedoes are the bread and butter of the ship, and they are extremely strong. You are able to launch 15 24k damage torps, well, depending on which build you use. I prefer the 12km range one, since I feel it gives it the most versatility, which is of course one of the things the ship greatly lacks. It lacks versatility. And if you have a ship that is purely focused on one type of thing, and you have it focused on torpedoes, it's going to be hard to be consistent because the torpedoes are innately not consistent. You can get unlucky when you launch your torps, someone is running Hydra, spots them, a random plane flies over. There are plenty of cases where you will deal 0 damage. And that's, of course, being more gun focused is significantly more valuable because it doesn't matter if someone spots your shells or anything. Guns will consistently deal damage. There's never a case where you shoot at someone for a minute and you won't deal any damage. That really doesn't happen. Whereas you can easily spend several minutes torping a target and get 0 hits and 0 damage and 0 rewards. So torpedoes are innately an inconsistent tool, which is why being a hybrid or being a pure gunboat tends to lead to significantly more consistent results. But that doesn't mean that this ship is only made of weaknesses, or like it's purely made of weaknesses, because there are situations where the Shimakaze excels. In fact, there are once again situations where the Shimakaze is the absolute best. Now, because of how unreliable torpedoes are, the times where the Shimakaze performs the best is naturally when he has the highest chance of landing the torpedoes. And that is, of course, when the enemy pushes into you. And in those cases, I can't really think of any destroyer that is better at dealing and slowing down and harassing the enemy than the Shimakaze. Because the ability to launch 15 of these incredibly hard-hitting, fast torpedoes with great range as well is just so incredibly powerful, especially because torpedoes are the best type of damage in the game. What do I mean when I say they are the best type of damage? Well, first of all, torpedo hits are almost 100% certain to land, to cause flooding, especially Shimakaze torps. You have an extremely high chance of causing the flooding. You can see every hit I cause here is a guaranteed flooding. So that, of course, puts the damage control on cooldown, or if they don't have the repair, it causes them to eat a ton of flooding. Also, torpedo damage counts as citadel hits, which means it can only be repaired 10% off. So these 3 torps that I just, for example, landed on cruisers, which aren't in general that easy of a target, but because they were coming towards me and I was kiting away and launching all those torps their way, they could not dodge them. And in these cases, it's almost like I just landed 4 or 5 battleship citadels on those cruisers. So this is the situation where the Shimakaze absolutely excels. Another reason, or another perk, that has had both a positive and a negative impact on how the Shimakaze plays is of course RPF, meaning or radio location. It used to be called radio positioning finder, so that's why people call it RPF. Now this has both negative and positive impacts on how the Shimakaze plays. It has negative impacts in the sense that it makes flanking attacks significantly harder. Being able to torp from an unexpected direction is of course incredibly important for a pure torpedo boat like the Shima. On the other hand, there are ways that RPF can greatly benefit the Shimakaze. Now, one of the benefits are of course the ability to see gunboats before, or have an idea of where the gunboats are before they actually enter gun range or vision range in general. And of course, when you have 15 torpedoes, it means you have this ability to saturate a certain zone, a certain area of the map, and with the help of RPF you can often predict which way the enemy gunboat might be coming. So while RPF has had a negative impact in the sense that the flanking is harder, the ability to predict and anticipate where gunboats might be coming from gives you the opportunity to land a torpedo, because once again, extremely fast, extremely hard hitting, and the biggest volume of them means that, for example, we see RPF pointing and the cap contested, so I know there's a DD coming around this border or around this corner any second, so I preemptively launch 2 volleys of torps and then a third soon after, and just like RPF told me, there was a Fletcher lying in wait. And now Fletcher of course has far better firepower than you have, and he could easily outgun me. But because I already launched my torps preemptively, because RPF told me he was coming, I'm able to land a torpedo hit. And even though he angles and takes it on the nose, it doesn't matter, because these torps do so much damage that this torpedo hit easily gives me the early blood and gives me the easy kill against the gunboat. So while RPF does have negative side effects, there are also positive side effects, especially when you contest caps, since if you do manage to land these preemptive torpedoes, it turns it into a very easy gunfight victory for you. Ultimately though, even though it does have these strengths, these situations, these are of course very few and very special occasions in general where the Shimakaze truly shines. And the weaknesses this ship has is of course it can't gunfight. It struggles to gunfight against pretty much any other gunboat or hybrid in the game. It's extremely vulnerable to carriers because it doesn't have the Russian speed and it doesn't have the defensive AA of, for example, the US line. So the Shimakaze does have a lot of weaknesses, and because of the main armament being torpedoes, it's also highly inconsistent. So I cannot in any way recommend the Shimakaze in its current state, because I feel it suffers and struggles too much in the current state of the game, and the other ships are capable of being torpedo threats while at the same time also having a much larger impact on the outcome. But of course, I will leave the final call to you guys, and I will move on to the next almost most popular ship in the game, one of the DDs that has been around since the very start, and that is of course the gearing. The gearing, just like the Shimakaze, has a 5.9 km concealment, but the difference is that the gearing has significantly slower speed. The Shimakaze is quite fast and quite agile, but the gearing is quite a bit slower. Now it's not as slow as a cruiser, for example, but you do notice the difference when you play the other destroyers and you move on to the gearing. It gets left in the dust quite easily. And now it also has a weakness, and that is the size. If we look at the thickness, of the gearing and we compare it to the Shimakaze, you notice how much slimmer the Shimakaze is. Now this slimness is actually a pretty big factor, because having a thicker hull means a higher chance of penetration damage being eaten by battleships. or even cruisers. So the gearing is especially vulnerable to these big AP volleys and eating these huge chunks of damage from them, which is of course a pretty damn big downside. In return though, the gearing does have access to defensive anti-air, which is of course a huge tool. It does not share the weakness the Shimakaze has against carriers. In fact, it is able to counter carriers quite easily with the help of this. Well, not counter them per se, but able to save itself and usually waste the carrier's time or waste his strike, since it's pretty much impossible to strike a gearing with defensive AA up. Now, the torps on this ship are pretty damn good. Well, in terms of range, they have 16.5 kilometers of range, and they do deal a decent amount of damage at 17.9 km. These torps are much stealthier than the Shimakaze torps. The Shimakaze's weakness on the torps is of course that they are spotted from quite far away, whereas gearing torps are extremely stealthy, so they are more consistent. In return though, we see 104-second reload with this build, and Shimakaze has 117, so we're talking a difference of 13 seconds, but the Shimakaze launches 15, whereas the gearing only launches 10 torps at a time. And these higher spreads are of course better at dealing with incoming forces and like heavy pushes coming your way. And of course the difference in the damage is pretty massive, 17.9 km, about 18k versus 24k, so we are talking a 33% damage difference in favor of the Shimakaze. Now, the thing is though, the gearing does not rely on the torpedoes the way the Shimakaze does. The gearing has many different strengths in its favor. The most obvious and straightforward strength is of course the sheer gun power the gearing has. There's not really any destroyer in the game that wants to spend time close to an enemy gearing, because, well, if they do, you can open up with these incredibly rapidly reloading guns, and the HE brakes module sets fires, and most importantly of all, does incredibly fast and efficient DPM to enemy destroyers. A few seconds near a gearing can cost you half your health pool. So obviously this means that gearings tend to be quite the capture point bullies, especially against any sort of Japanese DD that can pretty much just dies if he tries to engage or tries to fight the gearing. The gearing does of course have downsides to these shells. They are quite slow, and that means of course at any sort of large distances they tend to have huge arcs, which makes them quite hard to hit. It is the downside that the gearing has to pay for having all this great DPM. Worth noting though is that these guns are dual purpose, meaning they also work as anti-air guns, so that of course greatly helps the anti-air. But overall, this combination of firepower and long-range torpedo power means that, well, you can harass enemies at multiple different fronts, and you're not really an opponent that anyone wants to fight. In fact, seeing random torpedo hits pop up on targets on torps you launched almost a minute ago isn't in any way uncommon because of the great range, and in the meanwhile of course you're just using your guns to farm even more significant damage. So the gearing is this massive multi-purpose threat, and most importantly it is also the best team player in the game. In fact, if I had selected the thing that gearing was the best at in the entire game, it's not really the best torpedo boat, it's not really the best gun boat, but it is the best team playing destroyer. The smoke it has lasts, well, the bloom time is 30 seconds as opposed to, for example, Shimakaze's 20 seconds. So it blooms for 50% longer, which means you can make larger and longer smoke corridors for your teammates. It also lasts 130 seconds as opposed to Shimakaze's 97-second smoke. So we're talking about a pretty damn impressive 33-second smoke advantage as well. So you can smoke up allies. You can provide defensive AA for battleships or DD mates in general, protect them from carriers. You can actively scout for your team because you got such great concealment at 5.9. You can harass and stop enemy battleships with both firepower and torpedo power, and you can kill enemy DDs. You are the Swiss knife of World of Warships, a Swiss knife designed entirely to be the best possible teammate. So if you intend to play divisions, you have a couple of mates you want to play with, there's really not a better team-oriented destroyer in the game than the gearing. It is the jack of all trades, master of none, absolutely fantastic for helping carry your team to a victory. As I mentioned though, that doesn't mean that the gearing is without weaknesses. Weaknesses include slow speed, torpedo damage, and reload is not that impressive. The arcs on the shells, the shell velocity is very slow, and in general the range is quite limited, and even trying to hit things at max range is almost impossible. So there are downsides, and of course because of these arcs, trying to fight any sort of pure gunboat like the Russian gunboats is gonna end up in a loss at any sort of distance. As soon as they move out of 6 or 7 km range, that's when you probably don't want to even be fighting them in the gearing anymore, because their great maneuverability combined with your slow shell velocity means that you're in for a world of pain. Moving on though, we have a fairly new addition to the game, which is the Z52. The Z52 in its current state does have things it is great at. First of all though, we should start with the size. Once again, you might notice that this ship is only a slight bit bigger than the Shimakaze, but what is important is that the Z52, like all German DDs, have a weakness to eating additional AP, and this must be kept in mind because battleship AP is a huge threat to all DDs, but especially so for German DDs. Now, at first look, the detectability of 6.1 might not look that special considering Shima and Gearing both had 5.9. The speed is kind of between them both at 39.4, this is no doubt with a flag. And looking at the gunpowder, well, we see that the gunpowder is quite okay. The HE is underwhelming, but the AP seems quite strong. Now, what is it that makes the Z52 so special? Well, there's multiple things really, but they all come down to one very important tool, and that is the fact that the German Z52 can slot the German hydroacoustic search. This of course enables it to spot torps at 4 km distance and ships at 5.9, and this combined of course with the German smoke means that you can smoke yourself up, pop your hydroacoustic search, and you can easily see all the enemy ships while they cannot see you, unless of course they have hydro or radar themselves. And this allows the Z52 to become by far the strongest capture point bully in the game. There is no DD except another German DD or potentially Loyang that can fight a Z52 when it comes to capture points. While it can struggle slightly in standard battles, mostly because the torps don't really do much damage. The torps are only 14.4k and you only have 8 of them. In return though, you have the best torpedo reload at tier 10 at 68.9, meaning you can launch these torps extremely often, and the torps in general are fast and very stealthy, so it makes up for the power and the number with a very quick reload. But really, what this Z52 is absolutely the best at is contesting and fighting over capture points, especially of course in domination mode. With the way hydroacoustic search works in World of Warships, meaning it detects everything in that 5.9 km proximity, even things on the other sides of islands, it means any sort of capture point that has a landmass that you can use for cover are pretty much your playground. You can pull off the most ridiculous and the most insane outplays with this ship, and really people shouldn't even try to fight you in a capture point. If I see a Z52 go into a cap, I leave the cap, and that's pretty much what you should be doing. Here we have an example of a tier 10 game where I'm pushing in with my Z52. The enemy has Kagero divisions. Kagero of course has Concealment 5.5. It outspots me by 600 meters. They have radars, they have all these people, and of course I'm recognized. So, well, let's see what's happening. I push in, of course, I get very, very close to the island. As long as no one's contesting the point, there's no reason for me to use my Hydra or my smoke or anything. I just save the consumables and I capture it like any other destroyer might. I pop the speed boost to give myself better maneuverability, because I want to stay behind this island. And here we have a radar pop. As soon as radar is popped, I pop my Hydra as well to give me more information about my surroundings. And well, looking at, you can see how many people are targeting me. It's going 6-7 all the time, but I'm using the terrain to my advantage. It doesn't matter if they can see me because they have to push up in order to actually shoot me. And here we see it's a Des Moines that's actually radaring me, and we have DDs pushing in. And for any other destroyer, I would say this is even a Minotaur is shooting me. So for any other destroyer, I would say this situation might be like a complete death sentence. Radared by Des Moines, shot by Minotaur, destroyer division coming to kill me. Like, it seems like a nightmare situation. But then I wait for the radar to run out, and I pop my smoke. Suddenly, I am undetected, whereas the enemy is still detected. And I have AP loaded. Against slim IGN DDs, you might often want to use HE, unless they angle a bit, like this guy does, so you get those penetration hits, because this is one of the few DDs where you want to be using a fair amount of AP. My Hydra, of course, spots their DDs, and my Hydra tells me exactly what moves they're doing before they even do them. And with this, I can easily see their torps, I can easily predict their maneuvers, and the torp attempts to hit me. Well, my torps have no issues hitting them because they have no early warning. And whereas I have all the warning in the world, I'm easily able to dodge them. So not only did I secure the cap, I also double killed the Kagero division that tried to come and fight me, even though they had all this backup. And that is, of course, the massive strength of this ship, and really just shows what an absolute bully this ship is at contesting capture points. Once again though, of course, the Z52 comes with its own brand of weaknesses. Weaknesses include, even though the AA is quite okay, the AA values aren't bad, the issue is that it has no defensive AA, and these kind of AA values are simply not enough to actively shoot down any sort of strike coming your way at high tier. So carriers can of course easily deal with the Z52. Other weaknesses include the fact that the smokes are some of the weakest in the game. I did tell you that gearing smokes lasted 130 seconds and Shima lasted 97 seconds. Well, the German smoke only lasts 77 seconds. This of course means that if you see Z52 smoke up, it's quite easy to outlast and outweight the smoke and kill him once the smoke ends. So this is of course a huge weakness, and well, it's good that it has these kind of drawbacks. The upgrade the modules has helped the ship a bit in the sense that you can slot the improved speed boost. I have preferred to use the speed boost over the hydro, the improved hydro duration, because usually getting out and in and out of the situations is more important than the hydro is, because hydro is most useful when you have your own smoke up. So if you increase the duration of the hydro, you also increase the time before you can pop it the next time, and usually you want to sync this up with your smoke. But overall though, the Z52, what is it the best at? Domination games, fighting other DDs, close combat against other DDs, it's the absolute king because of the combination of smoke and hydro, and it's a pretty damn good torpedo boat as well. It does suffer from not being really the best gunboat because, well, very AP focused. The HE is quite pitiful with very low HE alpha, but it is a strong DD. But is it the best? Well, once again, I'll leave that up to you as I move on to another hybrid. Well, this one is a bit hard to just call a hybrid, of course. This is the Grozovoi. This is the tier 10 Russian, I would say, hybrid destroyer. Hybrid in the sense that it has very good concealment at 6.0, and it has very good gun power, and it has decent torps. Now you might notice that the damage is almost the same as the German damage, but the difference is almost twice the reload time. From 69.8 with of course my spec on the Z52, we go up to almost 2 minutes on the Grozovoi torpedoes. So unlike the Grozovoi that is very torpedo focused, or the gearing that is very hybrid focused, the Grozovoi is a hybrid that is heavily gun focused. The guns on this ship are excellent. The shell velocity, as you can see, if we compare it 950 meters per second, and we can compare it to the gearing that doesn't even break 800, you realize already that the Grozovoi in any sort of long distance fights will easily take out the gearing and will generally do well against all destroyers. However, the Grozovoi of course comes with its own branch of weaknesses in return. The Grozovoi is very similar to the gearing in the sense that it uses both the torpedoes and the guns to the maximum pretty much potential. But of course, the gun power and the ability to deal damage at longer range means that you will naturally use the guns on the Grozovoi quite a bit more than you will on the gearing. And of course, the weakness of the torps means that they will be less useful. But otherwise, you both have defensive anti-air, you both have very good concealment, and in general, you kind of like fighting other DDs. The difference here is the Grozovoi is quite fast, whereas of course the gearing is quite slow in comparison to DDs. But the gearing does handle significantly better. The gearing has a turning circle of 640 meters, whereas the Grozovoi has a 720 meter turning circle with a slightly slower rudder shift as well. This in combination with the fact that the Grozovoi has a pretty damn massive size disadvantage. What I mean disadvantage in the sense that the Grozovoi is actually significantly larger than the gearing. The Grozovoi is one of the largest DDs in the game, and this is of course a huge downside. A larger ship is much easier to hit. And unlike the Khaba, that does have some nice armor plating to protect it, or the Shimakaze that's slim enough that you tend to get quite a fair bit of over penetrations on it, the Grozovoi is both long, large, thick, and not very well armored. This means, combined with of course the turning circle of 720 meters, that even though you can push into caps and you can contest them, you are nowhere as eager to do it as the gearing is, because the Grozovoi can get punished extremely hard. Now in an equal 1 versus 1, I would say you can take on pretty much any gunboat, exceptions being Khaba, which is a pure gunboat. It's not a hybrid in any way, it's a pure gunboat, and the Z-52 if it has smoke and high drop. Other than that though, I would put my money on the Grozovoi in almost every situation. However, if there's teammates around, which there very, very often are in World of Warships, you do not want to be a Grozovoi spotted in the open. Battleships, cruisers, all of these, they have such an easy time hitting you. When you go the full tanky build that I have with 24.4k health, it seems like a lot, but trust me, that health disappears very, very quickly because of your lack of armor. So the Grozovoi is kind of the Russian version of the gearing. It is a good team playing destroyer. It has many of the strengths with concealment, great gun power, but it also has some weaknesses that it's kind of like the gearing weaknesses taken to the extreme, which is of course this huge weakness to any sort of incoming fire. Other than that though, the Grozovoi is quite a strong ship, and I think it's in a quite interesting position now. It's between the gearing and the Khaba. It's more gun oriented, but it's not the full switch to the Khabarovsk, which is of course going to be the last and final tier 10 DD that I will be covering. Last but not least, we of course have the Khabarovsk or Khabarovsk, and this destroyer is about as far away from a destroyer as you can be and as heavily gun focused as you can be. Even the torpedoes have been fairly recently nerfed, and well, if we look at them we can see that they are slow. 53 knots is incredibly slow, and they have a range of 6 kilometers, meaning these have very, very limited usage and only at point blank ranges, and you will rarely see much use from them. But that doesn't really matter, because your bread and butter are these guns. You have the most guns of any destroyer, sitting at 4 turrets with 2 guns each. Massive quick reload, huge range, huge rate of fire, great fire chance, great AP. With the health perk you reach 26k health, you are the fastest of them all, but then in return of course your turning circle is garbage. I said gearing had 640 meter turning circle, Khaba has 760. And of course, worst of all, in order to make the ship maneuverable, you have to give up almost all your concealment, to the point that it's not even worth speccing concealment, because you're not going to be spotting anyone. In fact, your detectability is a pretty staggering 9.7 kilometers, which is in fact worse than several of the cruisers in the game. Now, when I called the gearing the best team playing DD in the game, the Khaba is probably the absolute worst. team playing DD in the game. Attempting to go for any sort of capture point, well, you see what happens here. The 9.7 km concealment means that the enemy destroyers will easily outspot you, and honestly they will just call target on you and you will be forced to leave the cap, or you will take incoming fire from the enemy. Also, one of the best builds for the Khaba involves giving up your smoke for healing, which is of course makes you even worse of a team player. So you cannot really contest or capture points because it's so easy to outspot you and force you to leave the capture point. Really, the only chance you have is if one of them is dumb enough to pick a fight. The gearing, as I said, great firepower close range, but at long range, absolutely no chance against the Khaba. The Khaba is of course the pure gunboat. The gearing has the torps, concealment, smoke. Khaba has the gunpowder. And when it comes to fighting other DDs, if you get a chance to pick a fight, chance to actually fire at them, chance to close the distance, and well, if you get on their trail and there's nothing stopping you, they cannot deal with it. You are faster than them, you are better armored than them, you have better health than them, and you have more gunpowder than them. So in straight up 1 versus 1s against any sort of DD, you will crush them. But there are of course multiple weaknesses to the Khaba. First of all, the concealment means that as I showed you in that trying to cap that point, it's entirely impossible. The best build, which involves of course using the speed to your advantage and the maneuverability, means that you build heal instead of smoke, because you don't want to be stopping when you're on a run, so to say, and you want to give yourself that more sustain that you get from moving around. So that means you cannot smoke up your teammates, you cannot scout for your teammates, you don't have any defensive AA, you can't protect your teammates against carriers. You really have almost no team utility at all. The only team utility the Khaba has is if you have another destroyer in your division, if he scouts for you, you can help him fight DDs. But that's also something that really a cruiser can do just as well. So when it comes to team utility, the Khaba is absolutely the worst. When it comes to fighting other destroyers or in general being a gunboat, the Khaba is absolutely the best. So once again, we have these multiple aspects, and you kind of understand now when I made this comparison between these different destroyers, how hard it is for me to answer the question which tier 10 destroyer is the best one. If we're talking about fighting in a gunboat duel, well, of course I would pick the Khaba. This firepower and speed and armor makes it the best. But if we're in a domination game and there's not many DDs to begin with, Khaba really is not that useful at all, because if the enemy team just goes for the caps and takes the caps, the Khaba is going to have a hard time having any sort of impact on the game. On the other hand, if there's a carrier around, both the gearing and the Grozovoi are significantly, they rise in value significantly. And if the enemy team is, let's say it's a standard battle, something like two brothers, and the enemy team is lemming training down one side, which the teams tend to do very often, then Shimakaze is without a doubt the best destroyer. Being able to non-stop torpedo 15 heavy hard-hitting 12 km torps thrown into the enemy blob can deal some absolutely ridiculous damage, and you can pretty much stop the enemy push single-handedly. So when people do ask me about the best possible ship or the best tier 10 destroyer, all I can tell you is that it's situational, and that's what I've been saying so often. And now I finally have a vid I can simply link to, because this is one of the most frequently asked questions people ask. And ultimately it comes down to your playstyle, what kind of playstyle you prefer, do you play solo, do you play in a division, and of course what kind of battle it turns out to be. So there you have my answer on which tier 10 destroyer I think is the best. All of them and none of them.